we were speaking Italian. The nun grabbed me, took me to the janitor's closet, opened it up, took this filthy bar of grayish, yellowish soap and shoved it in my mouth and washed my mouth out. And after that, I really said, oh my God, I better not ever speak this language again. We lived with a lot of lies that were told to protect us. So what a vampire does is it feeds off of other people. And I said, that's what Italian Americans have done. They fed off of other identities, which is possible in the United States, you know.
Italian Americans became invisible the moment they could pass themselves off as being white.
I'm Fred Gardaphe, and I'm a distinguished professor of English and Italian American Studies at Queens College, and I'm also affiliated with the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute, the only think tank of Italian American studies in the United States. And this is what I tell Italian American organizations, that they are doing a great disservice by giving scholarships to kids who are going to college, because once they go to college, they find nothing about Italian American studies, you know, wherever they go. And they end up believing, if they haven't already believed it, that being Italian American doesn't matter unless it's something reflected off TV, which most of the kids, you know, they don't want to identify with. And so they fail to get, you know, confidence about their own Italian American culture unless they go to Italy themselves, which I always say is the only way for young Italians in the United States to reconnect with their background, is going there. And, you know, I mean, and for me, it happened when I was 26 years old. I was the first of my family to go back to Italy.
Wow.
And ever since then, that was 1978. And ever since then, I have, you know, that trip changed my life. It changed me away from traditional American studies into investigating Italian American studies. And when I started asking professors of my African American, Jewish American, Asian American, Latin American courses, what about Italian Americans? They said, well, you guys are white, and you know, you've assimilated. You know, you're not a minority, and you're part of it, and you don't really have a culture. Wait a minute, what did I grow up in?
You have a plethora of work, a huge body of work. That's amazing. But you wrote something in particular that it completely changed my view, and it has helped shape some of the work that I've been trying to do on the channel on my Italian side, which is, you called Italian Americans invisible people, not because people refuse to see them, but because for the most part, they refuse to be seen. Italian Americans became invisible the moment they could pass themselves off as being white.
Well, it comes a lot from my own experiences. In fact, most of what I did in Italian American studies began with reflecting upon my experiences, talking about it, and then connecting with other people who've had similar experiences. And whether it was through reading, viewing films, documentaries, running into people in different walks of life, whether it be you know, working class people, or, you know, white collar workers, or intellectuals at universities. There was a lot more to being Italian American than what I had been told or what I had witnessed. And I met a Black actress once who said that she became an actress because when she looked into the mirror of the media, she didn't see herself. And when I spoke to her about it, I said, well, you know, the mythical character who doesn't see themselves when they look into a mirror. And she said, well, what's that? I said, a vampire. And I said, what a vampire does is it feeds off of other people. And I said, that's what Italian Americans have done. They fed off of other identities, which is possible in the United States. You know, I'm not saying every Italian American has to be Italian American in a certain way, but right. When you don't see yourself reflected in the media, then you begin to say, well, I must be something else, or I will become something else in order to be able to be seen. And so while I was growing up, I never really thought much about being Italian. In fact, I thought it was more American. I never even thought of the word Italian American. And then in 1978, I was 25 years old. I went to Italy, and I said, wait a minute, I'm not Italian either. What
Mm,
not, you know? And
right.
I mean, the language that I used, the dialect that I spoke when I went there, um, nobody spoke it anymore, only the old
Right.
people. My grandfather's brother, who met me at the train station, laughed when I spoke to him, and so did my family. And they said, "Hey, you got to come down to the piazza." And I was talking with the old men, and they said, "Oh, you sound just like your grandfather,"
Oh,
because that was the Italian that I grew up with.
right.
So it. So I came back this kind of born again Italian American, and I went looking for Italian everything in the United States. Any old store where there were Italians in there, I went in and I started speaking to them, and I started, looking at literature. But I was working on a thesis on Walt Whitman, who I consider to be, the core of what I call the beginning of American literature, literature that doesn't imitate British literature.
Right.
And on my way into the library one day, I found Rose Basile Green's book, the Italian American novel. And I thought, what is this? So I sat down and I read the whole thing, and I said, I've got to change my topic. And when I changed my topic, my dissertation advisor said, you're crazy. You can't do this. There's no way, they'll let you do this. In fact, I had to leave University of Chicago to do that. It took me a couple of years. I wound up at the University of Illinois. I ended up finishing a PhD, doing an Italian American thesis, which was my first book, Italian Science, American Streets. And even then, there were no jobs for Italian American professors anywhere in the United States. That's the job I have right now.
Oh,
So,
congratulations. And
but
thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing that
hey,
I can just take and learn from. Like you really broke down the barriers that I didn't even know were there when you were talking about not really knowing or not really caring about being Italian American. I grew up the same way. My dad's side is Southern, Southern Italian. And to me, that just was this kind of like, we know it. We don't need to touch on that again. And my mom's side was from Louisiana, and that felt like more of an unknown, and I want to dig in. But being Italian was just from New York. It's like, well, of course you're Italian. Like, yeah, we're all there, and no more questions. Um, so when you talk about the invisibility in the school structure, there's really no way to get
no,
on
and
track to learn.
right. And whatever discrimination we went through in the past, whether it was through church institutions or work institutions, that discrimination still exists in academia. I write about how my grandparents were financial immigrants. They came in order to be able to survive. My parents were sociological immigrants. They weren't allowed to live in other neighborhoods. They had to live where they lived. And they were kept from going into certain neighborhoods in Chicago, where I grew up. And I realized that I'm a cultural immigrant. In order to, when I bring my culture into America, it's suspected, it's looked at. It's the first language, around the house. My grandparents would speak Italian to me and so on. And when I went to school, it was a little bit of a big transition for me. And I was caught, my friends and I, a few of us who spoke Italian, it was primarily an Italian Catholic school with Irish nuns, and they did not like when we spoke Italian. Well, one day we were speaking Italian. The nun grabbed me, took me to the janitor's closet, opened it up, took this filthy bar of grayish, yellowish soap, and shoved it in my mouth and washed my mouth out. And after that, I really said, "Oh my God, I better not ever speak this language again. I don't want to have that taste of that." In fact, I'm giving a talk in a few weeks in Croatia at the University of Zagreb on Anglophonia, and the title of my talk is going to be "English as an Acquired Taste." And, I mean I didn't realize how traumatic that was. Everybody, other people had it, and it's like in my neighborhood, if you ever got stopped or punished by an authority, it would be kind of like a badge of courage you would wear in the neighborhood. So when people would go to jail, people would not say, "Oh, he went to jail." They'd say he went to college. So that when I went to college, I first went to a junior college in town. And when I transferred, I went to the University of Wisconsin. I came back for Thanksgiving break, and someone said, "Hey, Freddie, where you been? I haven't seen you in a while." I said, "Oh, I've been at college." They go, How much did you get?" Thinking, how many years did I get? And I said, No, I went to real college. Oh, okay, I understand. You know, so college to us was, someplace that the people who did bad things went to. And they even named a football field after a convicted criminal in my town. So I mean, those kinds of transgressions were not perceived in a real American way. They were perceived as, you know one of the things my grandfather used to tell me when I did something stupid, or I dropped something, or I was clumsy, or whatever it was, he said, "Don't fare la menegan." Don't be an American. Whatever I was doing, acting. And when he found out that I was studying English, he goes, "English? You were born with English. What are you studying English?" I said, "Grandpa, I want to be a teacher." "Teacher? No, you got to be a doctor, lawyer, be something, And I said, "No, you break the language, Grandpa," because he always had to speak of the broken English. "You break the language, I fix it." Well, once he understood that there was a job there and there was something to be done, and he knew that his English needed fixing, he said, "Oh, all right, you got a job."
I'm laughing, but like some of these stories, especially the soap. Okay, so I think we hear this a lot about the Indian boarding schools where they're not allowed to practice their culture, they're not allowed to practice their language. I've looked a lot into that. And that's a big deal. And it happened on a massive institutionalized scale. But what you're talking about are these individual experiences that aren't really being brought together, because I'm sure you weren't the first child to experience that, the first town, the first school, whatever. You use a phrase that I used it on one of my videos. It whites on a leash. And it just lays it all out there. And you talk about how Italian Americans, how they're making it. Can you expound on that and where that came from and what you're thinking about when you're using that phrase?
Well, being Italian from a real working class neighborhood growing up, I was always very conscious of, because I went to a high school that, it was a top prep school in Chicago, Fenwick High School. It was a high school that was very difficult for an Italian to be at. There were no blacks or Hispanics. We were the minority there. And, it was tough. And when I graduated, I went into the Dean of Discipline's office because I felt he couldn't do anything to me anymore. And I said, "Father Piper," I said, "how come you always caught us? Caught the Italians. We were always the ones to get in trouble. How come you always caught us?" He goes, "Mr. Gardaphe, we always caught you because we were always watching you." And it was during the same time period in my neighborhood that there were posts of FBI in different places. And one of the jobs I had when I was a kid was to divert the attention of the FBI so the guys that they were trying to keep an eye on could go to the places they wanted to go to. And so it all started coming together there. This idea that, we were being watched. There was surveillance. It was like we were prisoners of war at some point. And it was kind of like a war between us and the FBI. Whenever the government would arrest a friend of mine's father and put him in jail, and, the neighborhood would come around as if helping the family to mourn, because we got to the real human side of this gangster crap you see on TV. They don't get much to the human side. That it affects families, it affects children, it affects grandchildren, it affects day-to-day living, being without a father, and so on. And it got to the point in my neighborhood, then I began to see that in order to be able to be accepted, we had to do what was expected of us. And that's what dogs on a leash. You put a dog on a leash because it'll go running around doing its own thing. But once you put it on a leash, then you restrict it. And to me, Italian Americans were put on a leash constantly, whether it's through the New Orleans lynchings, the Sacco and Vanzetti trials, the enemy alien status of World War II, the kind of shame that was put on, the gangster image in the 1950s and 60s. And by the 70s, the Italians were assimilated enough that that a generation could grow up without having those kinds of experiences. Some of which led to some trauma, and as long as they maintain that route, one of the things that I participated in when I was in college was working with African Americans in terms of protests and things like that, because it coincided very well with the Students for a Democratic Society, and it started, very well with the Black Panther movement to educate preschool kids and to provide breakfasts for them and lunches. And every time I went into an African American community, I was always suspect of being a cop. Because a lot of the cops at the time at the lower level were Italian Americans. Even when I went into the Students of Democratic Society, when I shifted from Chicago up to Wisconsin, I had to get, references from the SDS in Chicago in order to be accepted, because they were finding out that a lot of the people who were infiltrating some of the protest groups were Italian Americans who were cops. Oh. And so, but no, it seemed like even wanting to help, I was, suspect. And I thought the only way out of here is through the mind. You're not going to fight your way out of here. And so even as I began to proceed intellectually, people would deny the experience. They would deny the value of the literature. They would deny the quality of work and the Italian American presence in American history. And as I began to meet others in the same fields or even different fields, but other Italian American professionals, that's when I began to see that we didn't have to be whites on a leash in order to be considered American, but we had to validate what it was we did. And to me, the only way I understood a validation was through reading and writing.
You wrote, I can't remember where it was. I just remember I wrote it down. And when you were talking about the whites on the leash, you were talking about that the Italian Americans need to stay within these like corporate boundaries. Don't identify with other minorities and you can remain white. I have really, really enjoyed digging into the relationship between the Sicilians, Southern Italians in the South, and the African Americans down there, because the relationship is so bittersweet. At times, it seems like you see these people coming together. They're living in neighborhoods together way before there was integration. But then at the same time, every now and then, there's a serious violence that erupts. Can you speak a little bit on this not identifying with other minorities and maybe even how that touches on the relationship? You did a little bit with African Americans.
Right. But I think it's with every, one of the things I always approach things, and it's one of the faults I have, but it's one of the values I have too, is I approach things from a distance through reading. And even when I was young and I began to read, and then when I went into college, because pretty much what I read when I was young was by white people. And it wasn't really until I got a hold of The Godfather that it kind of woke me up that we could write about this stuff. And then from then on, I began reading and researching and writing and searching other cultures, taking classes in other cultures. I had an African American class at the University of Wisconsin And my professor there, said something. He says, white people got roots too. This was during the roots era. And he really woke me up to the fact that, I didn't understand my roots and I had to. And so a lot of that was like going back and looking over the family stories and going beyond the family stories and reading and writing. And then, then I would take courses. Now, what was happening in America in the 1970s and 80s, once we got done with the Vietnam War protests and all that, we began looking into, well, who are we? What are we? It was ethnicity became really big. And what we found was not what we were learning in school. So we began this whole idea of the multicultural movement in the United States, which created the first time they used the terminology culture wars. Do you read the white canon so that everybody has the same sense of experience and identity and it's all common and we can all identify with that and move on and create future identities through that? Or do we pay attention to? And I began to see the Italian American experience as being equal, at least in terms of worthy of study to when I took a Asian American literature course or a Latino American literature course, Jewish American literature course. The more I studied the other groups, the more I understood about myself. And, not only did I get knowledge about these other cultures, but I learned how people talked about culture in writing. So I began adapting my experiences and the experiences of Italian Americans that I had researched to these other ethnic groups. And I ended up becoming members of organizations like Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the United States, of which I eventually became president of. I became a member of the Working Class Studies Association, because I had never talked about being Italian American in any literature class until I graduated college. I had never talked about being working class at all until I left college. Even by the time I wrote my dissertation, I was at a conference, and people were talking a lot about working class. It was a 1930s conference. And I was actually at that time I was indexing my first book, and I realized the word working class I didn't even have a single reference to working class, and yet every writer I had worked on was a member of the working class. So the idea of recognizing it and seeing how you can talk about it. You need to recognize it first, and then you need to hear people talking about it before you could begin to connect it to yourself. So to me, that outreach enabled me better to reach into myself and see what it was I was dealing with all this. And it's just been such a rich experience. And I love what I do. I love teaching. I love doing this work. And people say, "Well, when are you going to retire?" I said, I love what I do. And when my capacity to do this dwindles, then I will think about retiring. And when it's gone, then I will retire. But until then, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Especially just knowing that there's someone like you out there doing this work makes me feel a little bit closer to retiring, because when you are in this field, you think you're the only one that can do it. You think that you have to do everything. You have to do the research. You have to do the writing. I mean, I've started journals. I helped start journals. I helped start publishing companies.
What did I know growing up? It was Columbus, and then about the mob.
Right.
That's what you have.
No, yeah. And the point is, we knew a lot. You did know a lot more from your family and your friends, but that was never validated or presented in school as something worthy of knowing. And so it immediately gets dismissed. And when Italian Americans dismiss it, imagine what the Americans who go on to power positions in the United States, they don't even have it in their repertoire unless they have Italian friends that have taken them over for dinners and so on and so forth. So to me, it's a very rich area, and It's richer when you begin to do. I teach a course called Italian Americans and Ethnic Relations, and I look at Italian Americans and the Irish, Italian Americans and the Jewish, Italian Americans and the Blacks, Italian Americans and Hispanics, Italian Americans and Native Americans. Last semester I taught a course in which I used a Native American novel and an Italian American novel. I used an African American novel and an Italian American novel in a course called Literary History. And what you begin to see is these people are dealing with the same things. The idea of hoodoo and voodoo and black magic, and all of a sudden you bring in things like Malocchio, and you look at a novel like Louisa Armelino's Black Madonna, and you begin to see, whoa, this is the same stuff going on here. And when you begin looking at the connections between Native American and Italian immigrants, oh my God, you see so many connections in terms of the way they value land, the way they recycle, the way they don't want to waste. The relationship between food and the body, and nature and the health. There was nothing in a store that my grandparents ever bought that improved their health. My grandfather used to say, "Let your food be your medicine, medicine be your food." I thought it was my grandfather, and but it makes sense. And when I'm sick, where do I go? What do I do for myself? I make shkadal and beans, or when my stomach's a little bit off. I once ate what was it? I ate a 4-star, the highest Michelin star meal once. And the next morning, I wasn't sick, but I just didn't feel right. And I knew what I needed. I needed some aglio olio and pepperoncino. I had a little plate of that, and I was fine. And it's, but it's not just that, it's the herbal things my grandmother used to make, the idea of fish oil. She would serve us fish oil in a spoon.
Yeah. I'm so glad we have the tablets now. I don't have to.
Now every night I take 2 tablets of omega-3s, but I can't help but laugh that they were onto that stuff. And to me, it brings up the experience. You talk about the experience of other. I was listening to a Latinx podcast. Well, I think it was a webinar back then during the COVID era. And they were talking about, we're trying to get our people to understand their indigenous backgrounds and so on and so forth. And I said, wait a minute, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to, and so I created this word called indigenuity. It's the creative use of our indigenous knowledge. That's basically what it is. And that's what I look for when I look at readings. What are these Italian American writers sustaining that is useful? I mean, and to me, that's the key. The key to the value of Italian American knowledge is maintaining the knowledge that sustained the people in Italy for thousands of years, and to some part Italian Americans. The problem is, once you lose the language, you begin to lose the formula for accessing that information. We do it through recipes, and we play a lot. There's a lot of stereotypes about Italian Americans and food, and we eat a lot. But if you look at it, what is it? What is the food doing? It's the most personal thing we do, other than sex, perhaps. But as regularly, and we're concerned about what we put in our body. I went someplace. I was at a hospital. And the last time I'd been at the hospital, I was able to leave right on the day of my surgery. I had a hip surgery. The next time they wanted to keep me one more day, and I said, I really can't. I really don't want to stay. Well, what's wrong? Stay, relax, stay for a day. I said, the reason I can't stay is because I can't eat the food here. And they said, oh, we have a new chef. I said, oh God, all right. So I ended up staying. Let me tell you this, I had the best ossobuco outside of Italy at that hospital. I called up the chef. I made such a fuss about it because food was actually good. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe a hospital with good food.
Shocking.
When did this happen? But most people would just say, yeah, I had some toast and some potatoes and this and Jello and I got through it. I don't want to get through food. I won't eat unless I know it's good, not just because it tastes good, but is it good for me?
Mm.
To me,
That's really powerful.
that's maintaining that indigenous culture, because we're indigenous too. I mean, and it's funny because they're trying to change Columbus Day into Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'm trying to get Italian Americans to connect to indigenous people, because we have indigenous DNA in us that we're not even aware of, and we have it in our habits. We have it and it's in the language. I mean, people are beginning to preserve the Italian American dialect that I used to speak. People are coming all the way from Italy to come and study these people who
Wow.
still.
Isn't that amazing to have it come full circle like that, though?
Right. And for
It's
me,
amazing.
going full circle means going back. It means going back to Italy. And I just recently bought a place in my grandparents' hometown. And I'm working on spending more time there.
That's so
That
beautiful.
place, that's the first place in my life that I ever went to. At first, I felt like I'd been there before. Second, it was the only other place besides where I grew up that I felt I belonged. I mean, really belonged. And
Wow.
and I learned so much. And plus, the quality of life there is so far beyond the quality of
Oh
life.
yeah.
So,
We've looked at it. We've kind of just done a reset here in our home. I've three little kids, or my husband and I do, and I was looking at the food that we were eating and just thinking about what were my grandparents doing? They were making everything from scratch. So we have basically cut out every shelf stable store-bought thing and started doing everything. And it has improved the quality of life. It's more work, but it's good work, because I feel like we have tried to save ourselves time. Like, oh, it doesn't take as long as it was for my grandparents to make dinner. Now I have more time to do what? Like scroll not on my phone. Like it is this reconnecting. It's so three-dimensional, right? It's intellectual, it's in the media, but it's like it's at home when you're making bread. And we have just started doing that, but I couldn't agree more. The things that are happening here are just, they're not good for us in general. Like we need these old ways. Like we need them so much. And yeah.
And when they're reinforced in the cultural products you consume, that makes you feel better and makes you feel strong, and also connects you to other people. I mean, I have never been more connected to all the other ethnic racial groups in my life than since I began my work on Italian American,
That's beautiful.
And now to me now it's all about. I think this is going to be my last academic book, and it's all about getting to the stories that I've always told. Because, like any good Italian American in my neighborhood, I do more than one thing for a living. And I became a teacher so that I could write. And when I started growing in my teaching, and the demand started growing for academic writing, I began doing that more and more and pushing the other writing out. But I've written a couple of plays. I've written a lot of short stories. So I'm going back to storytelling. Once I get this next book out, all the rest of my work is going to be telling stories. And the one story that I've tried to tell a million times is the stories of me going to Italy and my grandparents coming to the United States. So there's going to be alternating chapters, and it's going to end with me bringing my grandson to Italy, which I did last summer. So,
oh my gosh, I
those are the stories.
cannot wait to read that. I cannot wait to read that. I really do believe that people of all backgrounds, learning your family story, learning your community story, and sharing it is the secret sauce. This is what we need. This is what we've been missing, because I mean, I was born in the 80s, but even I can see it. Something is terribly wrong here in our nation. And you talk a lot about the trauma of immigration, and I would love to unpack that phrase and what that means, because I'm not an immigrant, you're not an immigrant, but it wasn't that far back that the family went through this.
This is what people don't understand. And even though they can say, well, yeah, my grandparents faced discrimination, but I'm where I'm at now, and these new people who are coming in, they got it made, to begin to see what is it. I was the first to go into therapy. Actually, I had a brother and a sister who went into a little bit of therapy before me, and I thought, oh, they were the weaker ones. They need the therapy. But by the time I was 50, I went through some experiences, and I went into therapy, and I began to realize that, oh my God, this is this happened and that happened. And I went and I explored the past and I interviewed my mother and my grandmother and all these other people who were still around. And I began to see the traumas that they had, and how they passed it on to me. They might not have passed it on through story, but because they didn't tell me the story, but they passed it on either non-verbally or kind of spiritually. They passed it on so that I began to see that some of my idiosyncrasies was caused by generations before me. And I think that that's the thing that really cemented me into going further with Italian American studies than I thought was even possible, because I've been writing about this a lot, and I even wrote an essay about going into therapy. So when my mother found out I was in therapy, she goes, "Oh, I think it's good that people go and get help." She goes, "But just don't tell them anything about the family." And she goes, "It'll be all right, but just don't tell them anything about the family." And I really, and then when I heard that and saw that, I thought, wow, this is really, and my mother died with a lot of untold stories that she would never tell. We lived with a lot of lies that were told to protect us, to keep us from thinking. It's not like we didn't talk in the family, but we certainly didn't talk outside the family about certain things. And in the family, things were very closely guarded. And if trauma is left unacknowledged, I'm not saying it has to be resolved, but if it's left unacknowledged or unknown, it goes forward into other generations.